Hello students, how are you? I hope you all are fine. In our previous lesson, we discussed about listening skill. In our today's lesson, we are going to look at about different scenarios. Before that, let me introduce you about today's objectives. Based on this, our today class, we are going to look at conditional sentence type 3. So, at the end of this program, the students are expected to achieve a certain objectives. The first one is you are expected to identify the form of conditional sentence type 3. Secondly, you are going to use type 3 conditional sentences to describe unreal situations. In addition to these two objectives, you are going to recognize functions of type 3 conditional sentence. That means you are going to recognize the use of conditional sentence type 3. So these are the objectives of this lesson. In this particular lesson, we are going to examine different scenarios. Based on these scenarios, we will also construct some unrealistic sentences. Let's see. Scenario 1. Look at this scenario, students. As you observe from the screen, sometime in the past, I want to send an invitation to a friend, but I didn't find her address. So, in the end, I didn't send her an invitation. Have you observed this scenario? Very good. Based on this scenario, we can extract some points about what happened in this scenario. Look, in the first scenario 1, in this scenario, I was intended to send. When we look at this scenario, we can extract some information from the scenario. The first thing, I was intended to send an invitation letter to my friend. This is one point. And the second point is, I didn't have her address. So I didn't do that. That means I couldn't do to send her an invitation. So as a speaker's intention is not takes place. Look, we observe different activities or different actions in this scenario. The first action is I was intended to send an invitation letter to my friend. The second one, I didn't have her address, so I didn't send a letter. That means the speaker action or the speaker's intention is not takes place. That means it is unrealistic or improbable condition. So from these scenarios, or from this description, we can construct sentences for each scenario. For this scenario, for scenario 1, we can construct a sentence. Watch carefully the screen, how we are going to construct a scenario. From the scenario, we can construct this sentence. If I had heard her address, I would have sent her an invitation. Look, this part, the first part had found as a past perfect. This is a past perfect. This is the if clause part. This is the if clause part. So the second one is the main clause part. This part is, we call it the main clause. Hello students, how do you do? Hope you all are fine. In our previous lesson, we discussed about the listening skills. In today's lesson, we are going to look at some scenarios which is quite related to conditional type 3. Before that, let me introduce you to the specific objective of this particular lesson. Please look at this screen, how it's going to set up the specific objective of this lesson. At the end of this program, you are expected to identify the form of conditional sentence type 3. This is one objective. The second objective is you are expected to use the 3 conditional sentences to describe unreal situations. The purpose of conditional sentence type 3 is to describe unreal situations. So you are expected to use these unreal situations in any circumstances. And the last objective of this lesson is you are going to expect to recognize the functions or the use of type 3 conditional sentences. So having said this, come to the each scenario. We are going to look at about 2 scenarios to examine how conditional sentence type 3 is working. You please observe this scenario. As you have seen from the screen, under this scenario, sometimes in the past, I wanted to send an invitation to a friend. I didn't find her address, however. So in the end, I didn't send her an invitation. When we observe this scenario, we can deduce different sentences, how these scenarios took place in the past. Let's examine. Look, in the first scenario, I was intended to send an invitation letter to my friend. This is one action in the first scenario. The second action is I didn't have her address. This is another condition. And the third condition, I didn't do that. That means I didn't send her an invitation. So we observe, or we can deduce these 3 conditions from scenario 1. That means a speaker's intention didn't take place. So we can deduce that, or we can summarize this situation was unrealistic or improbable condition. From the scenario, we can summarize that the condition was not fulfilled. It was unrealistic. So, how can we construct a sentence from this scenario? Let's look at. Look at this sentence. If I had found her address, I would have sent her an invitation. From that scenario, as we have discussed, from that specific scenario, we can construct at least 3 conditions. From those all past 3 conditions, we can construct a sentence like this. If I had found her address in the past, I would have sent her an invitation. So, the first part of the if clause tells us about the condition, and the second part of the main clause tells us about the result. So, in the if clause part, the activity or the action was not successful. It was failed. So, when we come to finalize or when we come to summarize this sentence, we understood that the condition was unrealistic or improbable condition. We will try to find out some important point about conditional type 3 in the next slides. Let's continue. Scenario 2. I knew Johannes very well, and I know that he never had much money, but he loved Ferraris. Ferraris is a type of vehicle or a type of automobile. He would have loved to own a Ferrari, but he never had the money to buy one. This is a certain scenario about Johannes. Johannes wanted to have a Ferrari, but unfortunately he didn't have much money to buy Ferrari, because Ferrari is very expensive car. We have these scenarios. Having this scenario, we can deduce different sentences or different meanings from this scenario. Look at this. In this scenario, although Johannes wished to have Ferrari, he hadn't much money to buy such a beautiful automobile. So, look at this. He wished to have Ferrari. This was Johannes' intention. And at the same time, he hadn't much money. He hadn't much money, this beautiful car or automobile. So, what would be the final result? The final result, he couldn't buy Ferrari because he hadn't much money. Though he wished to have Ferrari, he wouldn't have much money to buy a Ferrari. That means Johannes' wish couldn't be realistic. This is the result. Johannes wished to have Ferrari. Johannes didn't have much money. So at the end, he couldn't buy Ferrari. These are different conditions in this scenario. So when we summarize this scenario, it is improbable condition, as he didn't have much money to buy this car. So the condition shows that improbable condition that couldn't be realistic. This is unrealistic or improbable condition, because in the past he needed to have a Ferrari, and at the same time he didn't have much money. So what happened? What happened at the end? At the end, he couldn't have to buy Ferrari. So this is unrealistic or improbable condition. Based on this scenario, we can construct a sentence, a conditional sentence type 3 or unrealistic conditional type 3. If Johannes had the money, he would have bought a Ferrari. In the first clause, the main clause, this is the main clause, we use a past perfect which shows about the intention of Johannes in the past, and the main clause from this starts from the part of he to the end of Ferrari. This is the main clause. In the main clause, it shows the result. However, Johannes wished to have a Ferrari. As he hadn't had much money, he wouldn't have a Ferrari. So the first one is the condition, and the second part is the result. Let's see some points about conditional sentence type 3. Dear students, now it's your time to analyze and find out the similarity in both sentences. In both sentences, you have 3 minutes. Good job. Have you figured out the similarity of these two sentences? Have you tried to figure out the similarity of these two sentences? Very good work. As you observe, both sentences are similar sentences. That is, they have two clauses, the if clause and the main clause. Look this. This one is the if clause part. This is the if clause, and this one is the main clause. So that means in any conditional sentence we do have two clauses. The first one is the if clause, and the other is the main clause. The if clause is dependent clause. It has another name. We call it the if clause is dependent clause, and the main clause is independent clause. That means the main clause has a complete sentence, but the if clause or the if clause doesn't have a complete sentence. It's incomplete by itself. Similarly, the second sentence, if Johannes had the money, is the if clause, and he would have bought a Ferrari. This part is the main clause. He would have bought Ferrari. In the second sentence, I would have sent her an invitation. Both are main clauses. They are independent clauses. They can transfer a message by itself to the listener. But the first clause, the if clause part, if I had found her address and if Johannes had the money, two clauses we call it if clause or dependent clause, because it couldn't transfer a complete message to the listener. If you are able to identify this part, this is one point, and we will come to the next point in the next slide. That's good. The other point is the order of clauses. From the previous slide, we have seen that the conditional sentence type 3 has two clauses, the if clause and the main clause. And now the second point is the order of these two clauses. The order of clauses do not alter the meaning of any conditional sentences. Whether the main clause comes at the first or the if clause comes at the first, the meaning doesn't change. That means if the conditional sentence comes first, the main clause should be separated by comma. Always, if the conditional sentence begins with the if clause, there has to be a comma between the if clause and the main clause. But if the main clause comes at the beginning and the if clause follows, there is no comma. Comma is not needed to put between the main clause and the if clause. This is the second point. We observe that in the first point, we observe that there is, in the conditional sentence, there is if clause and main clause. This is one point. And the second point is whether the if clause comes at the beginning or the main clause, the meaning doesn't change. This is one point. But if the conditional sentence begins with the if clause, there has to be a comma between the if clause and the main clause. That means the if clause should be separated from the main clause by the comma. But if a conditional sentence starts with main clause, there is no comma between the two clauses. Look this. If I had found her address, there is comma, I would have sent her an invitation. So the red part of the clause is, we call it the if clause. This one is the if clause. And this one is the main clause. So, our point focuses on this. The conditional sentence type 3 may begin with the if clause. If it begins with the if clause, there has to be comma. If Johannes had the money, he would have bought a Ferrari. So, the red color, a sentence written with the red color is the if clause. A sentence or an independent clause written with a blue color is the main clause. Having done this, if I had found her address, comma, I would have sent her an invitation. This sentence begins with the if clause, but the second one, I would have sent her an invitation if I had found her address. The meaning and the sentence has quite similar, but in the first sentence there is comma. In the second sentence, because the sentence begins with the main clause, there is no comma between the main clause and the if clause. Similarly, if Johannes had the money, there is comma, but if the sentence starts with the main clause, he would have bought a Ferrari if Johannes had enough money. So, from these two sentences, we observe that the order of the clauses does give a meaning change, one point, and the other point, if the main clause, if the if clause begins the sentence, there has to be a comma. Now the very important part of this lesson is the form. This is one part of the main important point of this lesson. This is the form. The form focuses the general construction of a sentence, how the sentence is constructed. The conditional sentence type 3 is constructed with two forms. The first part is past perfect, this one, past perfect. The if clause or the condition is constructed with past perfect. And the main clause or the result is made with perfect conditional sentence, perfect conditional tense, I mean. So, this is the form. When we talk about past perfect, look this, past perfect has two parts, the form. We need to give emphasis on this point. The if clause always in conditional sentence type 3 constructed with the form of had plus participle. That means verb 3. This is one point. When we come to the main clause, we have to use perfect conditionals. That means it has three parts, which plus had plus past participle. So, when we talk about conditional sentence type 3, if she had time, if she had hard time, she would have visited her grandmom. So from this sentence, we observe that the structure or the form of conditional sentence type 3 and the if clause needs to have constructed with past perfect. That means had plus participle. This is one is had and this one is a past participle form of have. And the main clause would have is a perfect conditional, which is constructed with would, 1, and have, 2, and visited, the past participle form of visit. So when we conclude this sentence, if she had her time, she would have visited her grandmother. That means she didn't visit her grandmother. This was an unrealistic condition. This was an improbable condition. Though she had a plan, though she was intended to visit her grandmother, but she didn't do that. It's failed. It's improbable condition. So when we come to the form of conditional sentence type 3, we have two parties, past perfect in the if clause and perfect conditional in the main clause. So we summarize one point again. The form is constructed with, in the if clause, past perfect, in the main clause, perfect conditional. The last point is function. What is the function? The function refers to the use. What is the use of conditional sentence type 3? The conditional sentence type 3 is used to describe unrealistic, improbable conditions. Look this. If I had found her address, I would have sent her an invitation. Or, in case of Johannes, if Johannes had had the money, he would have bought a Ferrari. In both sentences, the conditions wouldn't have took place in the past. That means the subject I, in the first case, the subject I intended to send a letter to his friend or to her friend. But his ambition, his plan was not successful in the past. The result is I would have sent her an invitation tells us about the intention or the plan of the speaker didn't take place. That means it was unrealistic. It was hypothetical. It was imaginary. Similarly, if Johannes had had the money, he would have bought a Ferrari. As he hadn't had enough money, that means he couldn't have bought a Ferrari. Though he had a wish to buy Ferrari, he wouldn't have bought Ferrari because he hadn't much enough money. That means when we summarize the sentence, Johannes had a plan, had a wish to buy a Ferrari or this beautiful car, but he hadn't much. As he hadn't much enough money, he wouldn't have bought Ferrari. So, what do we observe from this sentence? It is unrealistic, it is hypothetical, it is improbable condition. So this was unrealistic condition. So when we conclude this point, conditional sentence type 3 uses to describe unrealistic or improbable conditions. Dear students, now it's your time to write some unrealistic conditional sentence based on the given scenario. Watch the scenario carefully. This is the scenario. The father and his young boy didn't agree on his watching football after 8 o'clock in the evening. So the father turned off the television and went to bed. The young boy turned it on and began watching football. When the father heard the sport commentator's voice, he stood up and came to the salon. he shouted at his son and put off the TV set. The young boy left the home and went to the nearby restaurant. There he met his friends and stayed till the midnight. Finally, he quarreled with drunken people and got arrested in the jail. This is a very short scenario. We have this scenario occurred in a certain house. A quarrel between a father and a boy or his son. Having this scenario, you are expected to write some conditional sentence type 3 or semi-realistic sentences. Before that, let me give you some highlights. We observe that the father and his young boy didn't agree. So this is one situation. The father and his young boy didn't agree. So what? The father turned off the television. This is another situation. The young boy turned it on. The young boy turned it again. And he started to watch football game. The father again, he stood up and came to the salon. This is another situation. He shouted at his son and put off the TV set. Again the father put off the TV set. This is another situation. As a result, the young boy, what happened? What did the young boy do? He left the home and went to the nearby restaurant. That means we can conclude that the young boy intended to watch the football game in the restaurant. There he met his friends. In the restaurant. Then he stayed till the midnight. As he stayed in the restaurant till the midnight, he quarreled with drunken people. This is another situation. And finally, he got arrested. So we do have these different situations in this scenario. Having this scenario, we can conclude that we can construct certain conditional sentence type 3 sentences, or we can construct some unrealistic or improbable sentences. This is the feedback. The father turned off the TV set again. The young boy left the home. The young boy passed the evening in the restaurant. The young boy quarreled with drunken people, and the young boy arrested by the police. These are some situations that can be deduced from the scenario. So, having this scenario or having these different situations, we can construct some unrealistic sentences. Look, the if clause. If the father and his son had agreed, this is past perfect. This is past perfect. Had agreed, past perfect, on watching football game. This is unrealistic. This situation didn't take place. Because of that, the father wouldn't have turned off the TV set. If they agree, the father wouldn't have turned it off. So this sentence tells us about it was not completed. Next, if the young boy hadn't turned on the TV set, we can deduce another improbable sentence. If the young boy hadn't turned on the TV set, the father wouldn't have shouted at him. You see, there is another scenario, another situation in the scenario. And the if clause, hadn't turned it on. The positive form of hadn't turned it on, it becomes had turned it on. This is a positive, and this one is a negative. So, if the young boy hadn't turned on the TV set, the father wouldn't have shouted at him. So, this sentence tells us about what happened in this sentence. What do you understand from this sentence? If the young boy didn't turn on the TV set, the father didn't shout at him. So at the end, because of this, as the young boy had turned on the TV, the father shouted at him. But it was unrealistic. It was hypothetical sentence. The last example, if the father hadn't turned off the TV set, the young boy wouldn't have gone to the restaurant. In this structure, the if clause, the past perfect, tells us about the condition. What happened? What happened in the father? If the father hadn't turned it off, the father has already turned off the TV set. But if the father hadn't turned off the TV, the young boy wouldn't have gone to the restaurant and get arrested by the police. But unfortunately, though the father had turned off the TV, the young boy left the home. And as a result, he gets arrested by the police. Before departing, let me recall you the main points of our today's lesson. We are going to finalize our today's session. We have studied about third conditional sentence type 3. Has two clauses. The if clause, that means the dependent clause, and the main clause, that is the independent clause. The independent clause specifies the result, and the subordinate or the dependent clause shows condition. It tells us about condition. This is one point. Concerning the spelling and clause position, it doesn't matter which of the two begins with complex sentence. However, in case if is at the beginning, a comma must be placed between the two. If the sentence begins with the main clause, the comma is not necessary. If the sentence begins with if clause, a comma should be placed between the if clause and the main clause. But if the conditional sentence begins with the main clause, there is no comma between the main clause and the if clause. Dear students, having said this, just as I'm trying to summarize the lesson, please write 3 if clause sentences and present to your teacher. Hope your teacher will help you in regarding giving feedback for your sentences. So, for our today lesson, this is all for what I have. Next time, I will come with the new topic. Till then, goodbye everyone. Goodbye.